Red alert on the Atlantic. Carrier Strike Group 8, a heavily armed naval formation headed by an aircraft carrier, is out on the Atlantic to rehearse a real case scenario. The purpose of the 4-week maneuver is to practice the tactical interplay between the warships prior to engaging in combat. 3 nations are involved.
Any mission, anytime, anywhere, we're ready to go.
The centerpiece of the group is its flagship, the carrier Harry S. Truman, a 1,093 feet long floating small town with a military airport. With 5,600 personnel on board, the Truman can accommodate 49 jet fighters. During the exercise, its crew will handle several thousand takeoffs and landings. The physical demands are so massive that all those involved always have to push themselves to the very limit.
Being out here is definitely stressful. It's a very stress-high environment.
A further 1,400 naval personnel are serving on the group's destroyers and frigates. Over the next few weeks, they too will be engaged in the most demanding military exercises. Fire on board has to be combated swiftly and effectively. Medical teams have to ensure that those with injuries or burns receive prompt attention.
Man overboard, man overboard.
And anyone going overboard into the cold waters of the Atlantic has to be rescued with all haste. Far away from the mainland, the warships will fire thousands of rounds of ammunition and launch dozens of rockets. Attacks will be controlled tactically from the group's operation centers. Stress in a confined space in the tough daily routine of life in the Navy.
Warn unidentified approaching aircraft in order to indicate our capacity for action and that of the force. Commander, over and out.
To defend peace on the world's oceans, that is the reason why 7,000 sailors, soldiers, and pilots are prepared to endure 4 weeks of torture on the high seas. 4 weeks that will see them grow together to form a powerful carrier group. The warships of the Carrier Strike Group 8 in the Atlantic. For 2 weeks, the American combat unit around the aircraft carrier USS Harry S. Truman has been on one of the U.S. Navy's toughest military maneuvers. The purpose is to train cooperation between units from 3 nations to make sure they're sufficiently prepared for deployment on a real mission. During the so-called Comp-2X military maneuver, the toughest tests of endurance were on the agenda for the 7,000 forces personnel on board the specialist ships. The unit was constantly under attack, with enemy speedboats, fighter bombers, and warships firing at the strike group from all sides, creating extremely realistic combat scenarios.
Cover, cover, cover. Banga, banga, banga. Hit on port side.
Firefighter units had to bring the huge blazes on board under control. There were numerous serious casualties. Soldiers who had to be rescued and given medical treatment by the rescue teams.
Please help me.
In the midst of the Comp-2X war exercise on the high seas, the Carrier Strike Group 8's 6 warships and attack submarine have taken up their tactical formation. Their objective is to protect the unit's flagship, the USS Harry S. Truman, from enemy attacks. The American Nimitz-class aircraft carrier is the focus of every operation. This floating military airbase accommodates 49 combat aircraft equipped with rockets, bombs, and onboard MGs. 2 high-tech destroyers, the Arleigh Burke and the Jason Dunham, protect the carrier's flanks with their state-of-the-art electronic weapons systems. The USS Normandy is an American cruiser of the so-called Ticonderoga class. Her main task is repelling attacks from enemy fighters or rockets. The unit's air reconnaissance is the responsibility of their newcomer, a German high-tech frigate, the Hessen. She operates as the strike group's eyes and ears. Due to its small size, the Norwegian frigate Roald Amundsen is also nicknamed the Yacht. She's an extremely agile vessel, and together with a nuclear-powered Los Angeles-class submarine, she circles the entire strike group to detect and fend off attackers from all sides. The strike group's 7 combat vessels haven't seen any land at all for 14 days. Their fuel and food supplies are almost exhausted, and for the first time since COMP2X began, they are now cruising in coastal waters again. So now's the right time to refuel. However, during a mission, it's dangerous for units to approach foreign ports or bases. Supplies are therefore replenished at sea. For Wrasse, replenishment at sea, a supply ship heads towards the strike group. These floating supermarkets have tons of provisions, fuel, and ammunition on board. This enables them to replenish the supplies of entire naval combat forces in the ocean. Such Wrasse maneuvers extend the unit's operating times significantly. In order to get the new supplies, each ship has to maneuver up close alongside the supply ship. A wire cable is then used to send a thick fuel hose onto the neighboring deck. Once the line is knocked onto the warship's fuel tank nozzle, some 3,000 gallons of fuel an hour can be pumped into the tank. These floating fuel stations can supply 2 such giant vessels at the same time. It's a very complicated maneuver. The ships have to maintain a certain distance, as well as constantly traveling at the same speed. Once refueling is completed, the Marines uncouple the fuel hose. This is always a great relief to the warship's crew. They can now continue their mission with a full tank of fuel. One after another, all Carrier Strike Group 8's vessels will take on new supplies today. And so they form an orderly queue behind the supply ship USNS Arctic. The high-tech frigate Hessen is ready to go. On the bridge, the soldiers set course for the floating supply station. Frigate Captain Oliver Pfennig is tense. The imminent Wrasse maneuver is an enormous challenge for every one of his 255 crew members. The adverse weather conditions are unlikely to make the operation any easier. On the frigate's bridge, the crew make their preparations for starting the maneuver and head towards the Arctic. The supply corridor in which the process can take place is defined precisely on the digital nautical chart to avoid entering the simulated enemy waters. This is when things get serious for the crew of the German frigate. They note many different factors, such as wind, swell, and tide. From this, they can calculate the required speed and the separation distance they later need to keep from the supply ship. Not an easy task, given the current rough seas. The frigate's monitors show the USNS Arctic getting closer. Time for the deck crew to open the railing. To prevent the ship's rolling and pitching movements taking anyone overboard, only these 3 soldiers, secured with special lanyards, are allowed into the danger area around the railing. Officer of the deck Sven Loos gives the crew their instructions for the maneuver's procedure.
The type of maneuver is Resupply, taking on fuel 110,000 gallons to full. Take off all watches, chains, rings, trouser legs in your boots. Only work on lines and cables with gloves. Everyone got their gloves? If there are no questions, then man your stations.
The entire crew of the Hessen are now fully focused. Everything has to work together perfectly for the Wrasse to be successful. Captain Pfennig and his officers leave the bridge. Their experience is now needed on deck. From starboard aft, the frigate approaches to within 160 feet of the supply ship, dangerously close for ships of this magnitude. The USNS Arctic is equipped with 5 Wrasse utility poles, with an 8-inch fuel hose attached to each one. She can store 4.5 million US gallons and can transport 3,000 tons of food supplies and ammunition. The USNS Arctic can replenish 2 ships at a time. She's refueling an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, while the Hessen is making her approach. To make the connection to the supply ship, a converted machine gun is used to shoot a shot line, a so-called bolo, onto the deck of the Arctic.
Don't hold your gun too high, right? And make sure it doesn't pull itself up after shooting it.
A weight is attached to the barrel of the machine gun to keep the line's trajectory low.
Bolo, watch out, fire!
Watch out, firing bolo!
Not so high. Very good.
Spot on. Now the soldiers pull the line back to the ship. It's tied to a special rope, which in turn is attached to a huge steel cable. The aim is to set up a zip line between the frigate and the Arctic. To do so, the steel cable is attached to the supply ship's Wrasse utility pole. The Hessen also has a so-called Wrasse utility pole, to which the soldiers attach their end of the steel cable. This multifunctional mast enables fuel, food supplies, and even personnel to be brought on board. A winch pulls the heavy cable across the separation between the 2 ships. Receiving the steel cable is a perilous operation. The soldier has to go right to the edge of the deck and consequently wears a special safety harness. He pulls the cable on board and hooks it onto the frigate's giant tank nozzle. It is then spanned tight between the 2 ships via the utility pole. The gigantic fuel hose is attached onto the Wrasse mast opposite. Deck Officer Loos gives the go-ahead, then the winch pulls the fuel hose from the Arctic to the frigate, enabling the floating tanker to pump tons of marine diesel into the warship's fuel tanks. The hose coupling slides along the steel cable into the Hessen's tank nozzle, where it locks into place.
Secured. Reporting, the hose is attached and latched on.
The Hessen is ready for refueling.
Yeah, start of pumping acknowledged.
Around 120,000 gallons of marine diesel will flow through the fuel hose from the Arctic into the tanks of the German frigate in the next 40 minutes. As any impurities in this mix of diesel and heavy oil can lead to explosions, the quality of the diesel oil is constantly monitored. During the process, the soldiers in the control room, some 50 feet below deck, are following the fuel transfer closely on screen. They distribute the fuel evenly among the ship's different storage tanks to prevent the frigate from listing.
Down here in the control room, we can monitor the pressure that refueling puts into the ship. And using our various slide controls, we can distribute the fuel into the different bunkers. We have 11 large storage bunkers and can store a maximum of 175,000 US gallons on the vessel.
The supplier's crew is now pumping 2,900 US gallons of diesel per minute through the fuel hose.
18,000 gallons are in the ship.
Both ships are traveling at precisely the same speed and are an extremely short distance apart. This is very important to prevent the hose from breaking, but it also involves a great risk. If the ships get too close, the flow velocity of the water passing between them increases and the water pressure drops. This creates a suction effect, which can pull the two ships together and cause a collision, the so-called Venturi effect. To prevent this happening, full concentration is required of the soldiers on the bridge. They constantly have to adjust their course and speed to that of the Arctic.
Both propeller shafts confirm a head 5.0.
The fuel tanks are now completely replenished, and the frigate is disconnected from the supplier.
Reporting all lines from board.
All connections to the Arctic have now been broken off. The soldiers close the railing and dismantle the gigantic nozzle from the Wrasse utility pole. With a full tank, the frigate is operational for 9 days, depending on its traveling speed. To transfer food supplies to the giant carrier Harry S. Truman, vertical replenishment is used. This involves transporting supplies from deck to deck by helicopter. The helicopters are equipped with a lifting hook, to which the soldiers attach crates, freight nets, or special weapons. On arriving at the Truman's flight deck, the pilot lowers the pallets onto the runway. The hook is then released, and the helicopter immediately sets off to pick up further supplies. The airspace around the ocean giant is now full of helicopters. For an operation of this magnitude, keeping track of the logistics is a highly demanding task, requiring maximum concentration levels from every single crew member. Now the forklifts take over and quickly pick up the pallets to clear the deck for the next delivery. The men load the pallets onto the carrier's huge hangar elevator. These so-called deck edge elevators are 3,880 square feet, roughly the size of a basketball court, and are normally used to carry several tons of fighter jet below deck. It takes only around 7 seconds for the pallets to reach the huge belly of the aircraft carrier. 20,000 meals a day are served to the 5,600-strong crew of the Truman. Keeping this floating town alive is a logistics masterpiece. To keep the crew supplied for 90 days, the galley staff need 55,000 pounds of meat, 72,000 loaves of bread, and 150,000 pounds of fruit and vegetables. The soldiers carry tons of post, food, and hygiene items through the giant ship's belly into the Truman storage facilities. A back-breaking job. But it's worth all the trouble. After the vertical replenishment, the shelves in the carrier's onboard shop are full again. Besides the vitamin-rich food from the ship's galley, this is where the soldiers find the comfort food to get them through their hard shift work. Such muscle-building protein supplements also help the soldiers keep their ruthless daily schedule. The USS Truman is now operational for another 13 weeks. On board the Hessen II, food supplies are low. Together with the Norwegian warship Roald Amundsen, the Hessen now sets course for another supply ship. They are now preparing for the so-called Pallet Wrasse, a complicated maneuver in which tons of food supplies are transferred in crates from deck to deck using a high-line harness. Both frigates are now moving parallel to the supply ship. All three are traveling at exactly the same speed through a corridor specially defined by the Strike Group Command. Only in this so-called Wrasse box can the replenishment be carried out. If the ships are in danger of leaving this corridor, the maneuver must be aborted immediately. The sea is still rough. Difficult conditions for the impending Pallet Wrasse.
Message to bridge, watch out, bolo shoot.
As for the fuel Wrasse, the crew takes a rope on board, and with the huge deck winch, they pull the heavy steel cable across to the frigate's utility pole. A short time later, the deck officer gives a positive report to the bridge.
Cable is attached and latched on.
The Hessen is ready to take on supplies, but suddenly the supplier sounds the alarm. 5 blasts on the ship's whistle is the command to break all connections immediately.
Stand by for emergency breakaway. Hammer, where's the hammer? Bring it over. Ready for emergency breakaway.
The special lifting hook can be released by a hammer blow.
And slip, and slip. Watch out, slipping. Come on, ease it out, ease it out. Come on. Over here.
13 men are needed to ease out the last line. No one knows the reason for the emergency breakaway, but they all know it has to happen quickly, because if the worst comes to the worst, people's lives are at stake. But in all the haste, something goes wrong. The line gets caught in the pulley wheel.
Right, cut it. Watch out.
Cutting the line is the last resort.
Reporting all lines cast off. Safety railing closed. Fall in.
From hearing the first alarm signal to cutting the final line, the crew took 5 minutes to carry out the emergency breakaway. On the deck of the Hessen, the relief on the men's faces is plain to see. The crew of the Norwegian frigate also successfully managed the complicated breakaway. Both ships now leave the supplier, and a radio message explains why the maneuver had to be aborted.
The reason for the emergency breakaway was the position of the ship. We were at risk of entering territorial waters where we are not allowed to replenish. That's why a U.S. destroyer gave us the command to abort.
As soon as the ships get too close to the edge of the Wrasse box, the maneuver must be aborted. In action, the risk of the strike group coming under attack would be too great. Partners from 3 nations are taking part in the Comp-2X maneuver. Forming them into a solid operational unit is no easy task. But there are maneuvers of an even greater order of magnitude. The carrier Strike Group 8 is training in the Atlantic. Thousands of miles away in the Pacific between California and Hawaii, the world's largest maritime warfare exercise is taking place, the Rim Pack. The Rim of the Pacific involves 45 warships from 25 nations. Over 20,000 military personnel are on maneuvers here, training joint anti-submarine and tactical air defense operations, strategic naval warfare against marine targets, mine-sweeping, and landing operations on enemy beaches. A special role here is played by special amphibian assault ships. In their well decks, they carry so-called assault amphibious vehicles, heavily armored military vehicles which are maneuverable both on land and in the water. These floating tanks can bring up to 25 fully armed infantry soldiers to almost any beach in the world. The 29-ton troop transporter runs on tracks and also has 2 additional water jets at the rear. The attempt to design amphibious tanks had already been undertaken in the First World War. They were also deployed during the Allies' D-Day landings in Normandy in 1944. The amphibian Amtraks, as they're called for short, are now heading to the Hawaiian coast to put hundreds of battle-ready troops ashore. To do so, they're steaming across the Pacific Ocean at a speed of 7 knots. Effortlessly, the 400-horsepower amphibians propel themselves out of the water and drive across the Hawaiian beach. From now on, every second counts, as their landing has apparently gone unnoticed by the enemy. Cautiously, the troops leave the protection of their tank. They secure the beach and head silently inland. They could be discovered at any moment. In addition to the tension, there's also the heat, insects, and their heavy equipment. Keeping their formation, the infantrymen move further into the dense jungle until they reach the hostile colony. Parallel to this, the Amtraks set off to fetch more soldiers. The amphibian maneuver is often the beginning of a complex battle scenario and is enormously important to the units for training optimal cooperation in action.
Including the United States, there are 11 partners working in the amphibious side of this exercise. It's all about relationships, getting to know the people that you're going to work alongside, understanding their capabilities, how they operate, and how best we as a team can integrate and train together. Taking a look at how we conduct business from a ship-to-objective maneuver across the board is what we as an amphibious force are looking to improve in our training and our readiness.
Even more high-tech military vehicles are concealed in the bellies of the amphibian assault ships. These LCACs are hovercraft traveling on pressurized air, blown out downwards, that forms a kind of cushion between the craft and the water surface. The LCACs are driven by 4 large propellers and can shoot across the water at speeds of up to 60 miles an hour. The 12,000 horsepower hovercraft transport heavily armed military trucks, ammunition, and combat tanks to the coast. Each hovercraft can carry a maximum load of 75 tons ashore. A soldier navigates the boat over the beach, creating a minor sandstorm. The hovercraft's most effective cargo are these amphibian tanks on wheels, the LAVs. With a crew of 6 infantrymen, these 13-ton reconnaissance vehicles secure the combat zone. Armed to the teeth, they too now launch themselves into the rim-pack maneuver. The units deploy artillery just as they would in a World War battle. The hovercraft inflates its skirt and is on its way to pick up even more supplies. The advantage of these 12,000 horsepower vehicles is that they are extremely fast and can put troops ashore without them having to wade through the water. They can access 80% of all coasts worldwide, which makes them versatile enough to cope with any mission.
We increase our capability to address any crisis that may appear on the horizon, do it in an expeditious manner that already has a stage set with a common language and a common environment in which we can operate.
Okay. Oh.
The action begins. The soldiers attack. The battle simulation is so realistic that the recorded footage looks like it's come from a genuine war zone. Thousands of shots are fired, and the soldiers deploy everything at their disposal. Machine guns and grenade launchers blast their way through to the enemy trenches. The first opponents are eliminated decisively. and the troops advance further and further towards the enemy colony. From above, this helicopter adds to the force of the attack. Fully armed special forces now upsile down over the battle scene. They storm into the enemy colony, ready for the fierce fight for survival.
Yep, use the wall as cover. Claros, we're coming past you.
The attackers move from house to house, combing the area in a simulated search for enemy combatants. Everything on this training ground looks deceptively realistic.
Right side clear. Hey, check underneath the bed.
The scenario is deliberately so authentic to give the RIMPAC troops the feeling of genuine house-to-house combat. Numerous cameras observe the soldiers during the operation. The infantry instructors observe every step on monitors. They can intervene in the mission at any time and set up unexpected obstacles. All the decisions taken in the battle scenario are analyzed together at the end of the maneuver. In the narrow alleyways, the troops are quickly involved in man-to-man combat and hefty gunfights, resulting in numerous serious casualties.
Shot in the right arm, shot in the right elbow. Your arm's broken, but your arm's broken.
Wounded comrades jeopardize the mission and hinder the troops in combat. They immediately have to be rescued and given emergency treatment. Soldiers are instructed to go to ground in order to incorporate further challenges into the mission. This intensive combat training pushes the units to their limits. On a mission, every action is a matter of life or death. But every wrong decision helps the Allied combat forces improve and optimize their control of the battle situation.
We can see results from RIMPAC almost instantly. When our forces go back to their nations, those tactics, techniques, and procedures that were discussed, identified, can be shared with their fellow nations to decide how they want to improve their procedures, or how we, as a U.S. force, want to improve our procedures.
The 25,000 Marines participating in the 4-week Rim of the Pacific maneuver are constantly being pushed to their physical and mental limits. A Sikorsky transport helicopter is carrying a unit of Navy SEALs who are then dropped over a bay. Those jumping into the water here are elite commandos. These Marines perform the toughest special duties and covert operations, such as freeing hostages or capturing terrorists. To reach the coast as inconspicuously as possible, the commandos swim through the sea while carrying their heavy equipment. The swimmers gather together to turn over their dinghies and load their equipment onto them. From another Sikorsky helicopter, even more special forces now jump into the water. Those who don't fit in the dinghies are pulled along the side. The aim of the mission is to eliminate the enemy on land as effectively as possible, using the fewest forces. The naval warfare ships are equipped with the very latest in modern technology. They have highly effective digital weapon systems, sensitive radar, and complex onboard electronics. But even their predecessors fulfill a very important purpose. In SINKEX, a military ship-sinking exercise, these decommissioned vehicles serve as target ships. In the ship-sinking exercise, the RIMPAC participants test their onboard weapons and their complex detection electronics. To do so, the men on board this Canadian Halifax-class frigate man their posts in the Operation Control Center and set their sights on a decommissioned frigate. The officers align the radar-controlled rocket launcher and fire it at the veteran warship. The rockets, weighing some 300 pounds, hit the deck of the target ship at supersonic speed and sink it into the ocean. Sinking old ships has been taking place in various countries for over 100 years. Besides weapons testing, it also provides the opportunity to dispose of the decommissioned steel giants at the bottom of the sea. Before sinking, however, the ships are stripped of everything that could be harmful to the environment. This relentless ship-sinking training is only carried out in areas which are over 50 miles from shore, with a minimum water depth of 6,000 feet. Submarines also take part in the SINK-X off the Hawaiian coast. Their main weapons are torpedoes weighing several tons and highly effective missiles, which are loaded into the launch tubes in the tight spaces at the bow of the nuclear-powered Hunter submarine. The process is extremely complicated. The ordnance enters the launch tube on rails under the supervision of the submarine crew. They fit precisely into the 21 inches of hollow space inside the tubes. A weapons mechanic then unlocks the wings at the end of the missile. It is powered by an internal piston engine supplied with aviation fuel from the lateral fuel tank hose. The Marine applies lubrication to the nozzle to prevent air bubbles forming, as they could betray the Hunter submarine's position. Once the launch chamber is hermetically sealed, the weapons officer reports to the center that the missile is ready for launch. The crew in the operations center take aim at the target ship, digitally transmit the coordinates to the missile, and fire. Carrying some 500 pounds of high explosive, the missile smashes into the deck of the old warship. A total of 5 ultra-modern Hunter submarines are part of the fleet in this largest naval exercise in the world. While the RIMPAC has 45 warships training international cooperation in the Pacific, the carrier Strike Group 8 is continuing preparations for action in the CUMP-2X in the Atlantic. Tough tests still lie ahead for the strike force around the gigantic aircraft carrier Harry S. Truman. We last saw the German frigate Hessen taking course for a Wrasse box to undertake a complicated maneuver to replenish her food supplies. Together with the Norwegian frigate KNM Roald Amundsen, she was steaming towards an American supply ship. But after the ship-to-ship connection had been made, the supply ship sounded the alarm and the maneuver had to be aborted.
Stand by for emergency breakaway. Watch out. Let it slip. Slipping.
In the shortest possible time, the frigate crew had to cut all connections to the supply ship and release all the heavy steel cables. In the hectic rush, the end of a rope was caught in the last pulley wheel and had to be cut off with a knife.
Report all lines have been cast off.
The first officer was given the reason for the termination by radio. During the replenishment maneuver, the frigate came close to the end of the Wrasse box, and the risk of entering into enemy waters was too great. As darkness approaches in the Atlantic, the maneuver still has to be repeated. Deck Officer Luce hands out snap lights, which the crew members attach to their uniforms. The shot line weight on the converted machine gun is illuminated to make it more visible. To make sure no one gets lost in the dark, the men are counted.
We need one more snap light. We're now going into a night Wrasse. That means sunset is at 1800 hours. One hand for yourself, one hand for the ship. Always watch what the man in front is doing. It'll get dark now relatively quickly. We'll switch on the top lights as well. Everyone has their own snap light. Don't throw them into the sea. Why not? Because someone could think there's a man in the water and set off the man overboard alarm.
These differently colored signal lights are to enable communication with the supply ship. The onset of darkness means the frigate must get even closer to her floating supermarket. The shotline gunman enters the danger zone around the open railing and fires. The crewmen use the shot line to bring the cable on board, with which the winch now pulls a highline harness from the supply ship across to the Wrasse utility pole on board the Hessen. Using the signal lamps, the soldiers on the Hessen show the supply ship crew the optimum direction and height for pulling the steel cable across. Then the so-called wire highline reaches the deck of the frigate.
Message to bridge, wire highline is on deck.
With the huge special hook, the Hessen crew couples the highline to their Wrasse utility mast to firmly connect the two ships. Replenishment at sea is a complicated maneuver and requires a lot of experience. All processes have to run together perfectly. Next, the crews set up a zipline across the separation between the two ships. To do so, the crew guides a gigantic pulley, the so-called white block, to their utility mast. It works like a bicycle chain, enabling the exchange of supplies and equipment in both directions.
The white block is on deck.
Deck Officer Luce navigates the first pallet on board. It catches the side of the ship, and the boxes almost end up in the sea.
Watch out, yes, watch out, watch out, watch out. Bit more. Good, all's well that ends well. Secured.
An illuminated trolley, also known as a crab, transfers the pallets to the deck of the frigate. They are then carefully lowered by the Wrasse utility pole. The cartons now all have to be taken below deck quickly to make way for more food supplies. To remain at sea for another 21 days, the 255 crew on board the Hessen need 11,000 bottles of water, about 1.2 tons of meat and fish, and some 4,000 pounds of fruit and vegetables. Each box is laboriously carried below deck manually by the soldiers. Meanwhile, the next pallet is already being hoisted up on the supplier's Wrasse pole.
Watch out, second pallet underway.
Pallet after pallet is transferred by zipline from deck to deck. Darkness and the rough sea don't make the maneuver any easier. All members of the Hessen's crew are deployed to take supplies on board. They have to carry every crate 460 feet over 3 decks into the special ship's storerooms. Fresh fruit is of great importance for the soldiers, as it contains a lot of vitamin C, and thus the required levels of ascorbic acid necessary for the protection of body cells. For many years, perishable foods were not part of the diet plan at sea. This led to sailors often contracting scurvy, a vitamin C deficiency that can have fatal consequences. All supplies have finally been transferred, and the trolley is back on board the supplier ship. It takes 3 men to uncouple the huge pulley from the German frigate's Wrasse utility pole.
So, very good. And let go. Reporting the white block is going back and we're fetching the line.
A hammer blow releases the steel cable's final special hook, which shoots from board. Then the frigate's crew has successfully completed the night Wrasse operation. For the powerful strike force around the aircraft carrier Harry S. Truman, the final day of maneuvers is about to begin. Submarines are one of the greatest dangers for the carrier Strike Group 8. In the depths of the ocean, they're difficult to detect, and their highly explosive torpedoes, with ranges of up to 30 miles, can easily sink these steel giants in For locating enemy submarines, all strike group warships have sensitive sonar systems installed in their bows. But because their search range is limited, helicopters are also deployed to lower special dipping sonar into the water to extend the search radius. This Lynx helicopter has a crew of 2 pilots and an onboard engineer. From the deck of a carrier strike group warship, they now take off to fly out over the open sea. The Lynx is equipped with a complex dipping sonar device that hangs from the underside of the helicopter, attached to a huge winch. The so-called dipping sonar is submerged into the sea on a 1,400-foot cable and searches for activity in the ocean within a radius of around 22 miles. A complex undersea plan is created on the helicopter display, which can then be transmitted by radio directly to the ships in the strike group. The sonar data recorded by the entire unit is displayed on the Operations Center monitors on board the Air Defense frigate. The results from the helicopter dipping sonar extend the overall searching radius available to the warships.
Also der Helikopter, der reported.
The helicopter reports the contact it's detected to us internally.
Intern an uns weiter.
If we detect anything in the water, we can direct our sonar at it. And an echo comes back, which is then shown here on the monitor. The high-pitched tone just now was the echo we're looking for. Once we have the echo, we can definitely say that there's something there in the water. If we now find out that it has course and speed readings that remain constant in keeping with a submarine's behavior, then we can say that there's a submarine down there.
The high-technology dipping sonar enables the units to organize an early reaction to any potential attack on the strike group. Precisely what this scenario would then look like remains confidential. 7,000 soldiers on 6 gigantic warships and 1 ultra-modern hunter submarine. For 4 weeks, special units from 3 nations have demonstrated in one of the U.S. Navy's toughest military maneuvers that together they are capable of mastering the most difficult combat situations and withstanding superhuman tests of their endurance. Day and night, the 49 fighter jets took off from the huge carrier Harry S. Truman to undertake complicated air defense maneuvers in the fastest possible time. Arresting these 32-ton Super Hornets on the narrow landing strip meant strenuous, back-breaking work for the crew on the deck of this floating airbase. During simulated attacks by enemy fighter bombers and warships, officers in the Operations Center rotated the strike group's fighters and destroyers. All units were on high alert. In complex combat scenarios, the soldiers trained the use of sensitive positioning systems and highly effective digital weapons technology. Interoperability between the international partner units now works perfectly.
We're able to go on deployment whenever directed by the President.
The punishing Comp-2X maneuver has bonded the warships of the carrier Strike Group 8 together into one powerful unit, ready and able to keep the peace on the world's oceans.
Any mission, anytime, anywhere, we're ready to go.